We're looking at John chapter 9 tonight. Those reading through, listening through some of the Gospel of John, and this just kind of caught my ear, and so I started looking into it. And there's some really neat stuff in this chapter. What we're going to try and do is go through this and kind of unpack it and look at the story and examine the lessons that we can get out of John chapter 9 tonight. So we'll be pretty much parking here. You can open your Bibles and put a bookmark there. We'll be bouncing around a little bit, but we will be primarily parking here in John chapter 9. As we begin this study and looking at this, we want to look at the context of what's going on right now. And just to give you kind of a brief context, if you look in John chapter 8, look at verses 43 and 47, or 43 through 47. You know, Jesus is teaching a lot. He does that, right? You know, throughout the Gospels. But not everybody's listening. Look in beginning in verse 43. Why do you not understand what I'm saying? Who here hasn't said that? Right? Parents, you hearing me? Okay. Why do you not understand what I'm saying? Is it because you cannot hear my word? You are of your father the devil, and you want to be and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I speak the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? If I speak truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears the words of God. For this reason, you do not hear them because you are not of God. Now, that's kind of harsh, Jesus, right? You just told them that they're a bunch of demons, basically, right? Essentially, you're not listening. You're not listening. If you're not listening to the words of God, then you're fighting for the other team, is what he's saying, right? So in chapter 8, they were not listening to the message. And they weren't really listening at all, but they weren't listening. In chapter 9, they couldn't see. They couldn't see what was right in front of them. So if you look over in verses 39 through 41, and we'll get to that later. But they couldn't hear in John chapter 8. They couldn't see in John chapter 9. And in chapter 10, we read about the sheep, that Christ is the shepherd. And he says, his sheep hear and see, in verses 24 through 28. So we're going to kind of unpack this. What event happened in John chapter 9 that sets off sort of a debate of faith? And we're going to be looking at this. Many of you might have a sub or a heading of this chapter. What headings do you have for this chapter? Healing of the man born blind, right? Healing of the blind man is what we're going to be looking at. This chapter is sort of broken out. If you outline this chapter, the first few verses, chapter 1, or verses 1 through 7, we have the blind man and Jesus, the blind man's encounter with Jesus. In verses 8 through 12, we have this man and the people, how they respond to what's going on. In verses 13 through 34, this man and the Pharisees, we have this sort of debate, theological discussion about what actually took place. And then 35 through 41, we have a sheep with his shepherd. And so we're going to look at and unpack. So this will be sort of our outline if you're taking notes, which I'm sure many of you are just taking copious notes tonight. You haven't done anything all day. So anyway, if we move along hurriedly, so the blind man and Jesus. If we look at what happened here, as he passed by, Jesus was prone to do that. Okay, so he was walking by. This is probably in the temple complex. Probably this was on the Sabbath. Now, according to tradition, according to what we read about the time, people were not allowed to physically ask for alms, ask for anything on the Sabbath day. But they were able to be there and maybe play upon the kindness of those who were passing by. And so there was this blind man. And so we see here, as he passed by, he saw a blind man from birth. And his disciples asked a question. Rabbi, teacher, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? Who sinned? It's a logical question. I don't know if you've ever hung out with preachers or people that go to preaching school, or if you've been to Freed-Hardeman campus and talked to the Bible majors and that kind of stuff. There's a lot of theological debates that happen from time to time, and this may be one of those things. Here's a perfect question. Here's an opportunity to ask a question of Jesus, and maybe he'll unravel this thing that we've been talking about, okay? Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? How does Jesus respond? Neither one of them. He just trashed their theological thought, right? That's just none of the above. Option C, right? None of the above. Love those answers. Y'all do fill in the multiple guess? Anybody? Okay. So yeah, none of the above. None of the above. So what does he say? It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So who sinned? If you're going to be talking about this, so what's the thought process? Here's a man who's born blind, and they're asking why, right? And what's their thought process on why he's blind? Somebody did something. Somebody did something wrong here. He's blind, right? This is the Louisville Slugger God that some people espouse, that God is just waiting for you to mess up and hit you on the head when you mess up. But what does Ezekiel 18:20 say? Somebody want to look that up? You may want to write that out in the margins. Ezekiel 18:20. So the soul that sins, it will die. You will not be inheriting sin, as was what is espoused by some today. You will not be inheriting sin from anybody else. You get your own scorecard on that one, okay? Nor will you inherit the righteousness of anybody else. The soul that sins, it will die. And this is the same discussion that Luke chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. If you want to turn briefly over there to Luke chapter 13. Again, Jesus teaching about this same kind of thought. Now, on the same occasion, there were some present who reported to him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. And Jesus said to him, "Do you suppose that these Galileans were greater sinners than all other Galileans because they suffered this fate? I tell you, no, but unless you repent, you will likewise perish. Or do you suppose that those 18 on whom the Tower of Siloam fell and killed them were worse culprits than all the men who lived in Jerusalem? I tell you, no, but unless you perish, or unless you repent, you will likewise perish." So the concept is rampant then, that if something bad happens to you, it's because you did something wrong. Now, there are commandments in the law that talk about to obey the commandments, that it may be well with you, as what when you go into the land that I will give you. That is written in the law, but that is not what is trying to be conveyed in that teaching. But they took it to mean that if anything bad happens, it's because you did something wrong. There's a whole book devoted to that, right? Job and his lousy friends, right? So that's a book that kind of deals with that concept. So who sinned? Romans 3:23, who sinned? For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So all have sinned. This concept that the works of God might be displayed. Look at John chapter 6. It's nice when we can kind of look and just stay in the same book and give us some information about this. John chapter 6. Verses 28 through 29. Therefore they said to him, "What shall we do so that we may work the works of God?" Jesus answered and said to him, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him who he has sent." So this belief is the work of God. And look over John chapter 11, verse 4, and tie this in. John 11, verse 4, "But when Jesus heard this, he said, 'This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so the Son of God may be glorified by it.'" And so, when Lazarus was raised from the dead, he prays, but he prays because he wants the people's faith to be lifted up because of what was happening. In the same situation here, these events were to build faith. And John tells us what about the reason for the writing of the letter. In John chapter 20, end of John, he says, "These were written, many other things that Jesus do, but these were written that you might have" what? Faith, that you might believe, So these specific things in the book of John were written for faith, were given to us for faith. And so this works of God, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. "We must work the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." You've heard that before, right? I am the light of the world. Look in John. John kind of opens up with this concept, right? In John chapter 1. John chapter 1, verses 4 through 5 opens up with this concept of light. Talking about the Word. The Word was God. In verse 4, "In him was life, and the life was a light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it," or could not overtake it, could not overwhelm the light that was there. And if we look over in 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, how many of you have been in darkness before? Like you couldn't see your own hand, right? That is overwhelming, suffocating darkness. And then Jesus comes in as light. In 2 Corinthians 4:4, "In whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving so they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." So there are those who are blind, and we're going to be talking about those tonight. There are those who are in this chapter who are blind, and we'll be talking about them. And so in light of that, Jesus heals this blind man. So here's this blind man, and just try and picture this. Here's a blind man, probably not dressed very well, probably not very well taken care of. He doesn't have a lot of extra monies to be spent on niceties, so he's probably not very well taken care of. Jesus makes clay, spits and makes clay, rubs it on his eyes, and what does he tell him? "Go and wash in the pool Siloam," which is translated "sent," and so he went away. Okay, so Jesus spits, and there are several occasions where Jesus uses spit to heal. In Mark chapter 7 and chapter 8, Jesus does this. Why is Jesus using spit? We can speculate about what the significance of this. There was in the Jewish Torah or Talmud, which is the collection of basically a Jewish commentary on the Torah and on law, how to interpret the law. It was a collection of traditions, and we'll look at that a little bit later. But in that book, it said that if there was ever a dispute about who was the firstborn son, which happens, right? Apparently happened a lot. If there was ever a dispute, then the spit that healed somebody first, it was that person's spit that was the legitimate firstborn son, which led to the belief that the firstborn son's spit was had more healing properties than others. Okay? Back then, they thought spit healed stuff. Just saying, okay? We know it's like Mother's 409, it cleans stuff, right? Right? Does that happen to you guys? They spit and wipe it off? Nasty. Okay, so it cleans stuff. We're more in the Windex or oil, kind of thing nowadays, right? So, but anyway, so that's maybe what it is, but we don't know exactly. Malachi chapter 4, verse 2 says that he would come healing, that he would be healing. And so this is something that was prophesied that he would be doing. And so he is healed. He goes away. And then we go into the next section of what's going to be happening. And this man and the reaction to a healed man in verses 8 through 12. So Jesus starts something. Have you ever done something? Just before you do it, you're thinking, this is going to be crazy. I don't know what's going to happen. You ever done that? Fireworks? Anybody? Okay. Yes, it happens. So Jesus starts something. He knows what's about to happen. He knows exactly what's about to happen. And he's starting off a storm again with the Pharisees. Because he'd already gotten in trouble, quote unquote, for healing on the Sabbath. And here he is doing it again. And so this is something that Jesus is doing so that people can learn about what's going on. Again, that God will be glorified. And so therefore the neighbors and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is not this the one who used to sit and beg? Hey, isn't this that guy? Isn't that guy? So they didn't have like YouTube where they could see this happen or anything. So isn't this that guy? Others were saying, this is he. Yeah, this is him. Still others were saying, no, but he is like him. It's just it's his stunt double. It's not really him, all right? It's not him. But look what he says. But he kept saying, I'm the one. Yes, it's me. It's me. It's me. I think it's interesting that it says he kept saying. So it wasn't like he just said it once and then went on his merry way and didn't care what other people thought. He evidently cared enough to say, yes, jumping up down, yes, it is me. I am the one that was born blind. Yes, this is good news. Which, it's interesting. Here's a man who was blind from birth. How is he going to know to get around? We thought about that? How do you hear about people who are blind? How do they navigate? Sound? A cane? They count steps, from place to place. So now you can see. He's probably counting steps back home because he's never seen his surrounding before. I think it's just interesting. So anyway, here's this guy, born blind. He's screaming and shouting, it was me. I was that guy. I was that guy. But everybody around him saying, no, couldn't be, nope. And so they asked him, well, how did that happen, right? How then were your eyes opened? He answered, the man who was called Jesus made clay. He didn't know it was spit, apparently. Made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went away and washed, and I received my sight. And they said to him, where is he? He said, I don't know. But this is what I did. He told me to do it. I did it. I'm healed. We see that a lot, that mathematical progression, right, with Jesus. Do what he says, that it may be well with you, that you get healed in this case. Enter the Pharisees, stage left, right? So we go on to what the Pharisees have to say about this, in verses 13 through 34. And so they brought him, so that they, the infamous they, we don't know who they are, but they always know the right things to say, right? Well, they said. So they brought him to the Pharisees. Sabbath, interesting thing here, Sabbath day, the Sanhedrin, which is sort of a ruling council, could not convene on the Sabbath day. So they brought him to a group of Pharisees, all right? Apparently the next best thing, otherwise known as the God Squad. So here are the religious elite, okay? The religious elite. They know how to interpret the law. They know all about righteousness, right? They know exactly what to do in this situation. And so they bring him to the Pharisees. And they've already had problems with this upstart Jesus. How much time do we have, by the way? People are walking out already. Man, okay, so they've already had problems with this Jesus, okay? So, and they're already getting in trouble. He's already getting in trouble for healing on the Sabbath. And here he is, doing it again, healing on the Sabbath. But the Pharisees want to know about it. Everybody knows that the Pharisees want to know about it. So they bring him to the Pharisees, the man who was formerly blind, man formerly known as blind. Now it was the Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes, and the Pharisees were asking him again, and received his sight. And he said to them, He applied clay to my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees were saying, This man is not from God, because he's doing it. He does not keep the Sabbath. And what's the deal with the Sabbath? You can't work. Can't work. Some things that are specifically mentioned are you can't make a fire. You can't collect wood. You can't cook. You can't farm. You can't sow. You can't do anything productive as far as your normal household chores. You can't prune anything. You can't do any of that kind of stuff. Those are things that are specifically mentioned. It never says you can't heal somebody on the Sabbath. Now, some things to look at. Mark chapter 2, verse 28, Jesus says that he is Lord of the Sabbath. So he can do that, okay? He healed, and there are several other miracles that he did on the Sabbath. There's a list there if you want to look at those things. But look over at Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14, here's a man with dropsy, and they're already getting on to him for healing on the Sabbath. And he says let's start with verse 5. And he said to them, Which one of you will have a son or an ox fall into a well, it will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could make no reply to this. And there was another occasion, I think it's in Luke 13, where he's talking about healing somebody. And he said, How many of you would lead your ox to water on this day, but this person this person needs to be healed? How much more important is this person than watering your own ox? So he talks about some of the craziness, because what they had done is they had added extra things that they couldn't do. For example, in this situation, it would have been lawful for Jesus to put like water mixed with wine on the outside of the person's eyes, but if he did anything to the inside of the eyes, that would not have been lawful. That is not written in the Bible. That is written in the Talmud, the traditions that they've set up, how they've interpreted the law and what it means. And so they are perfecters of their traditions. And so here is what they're saying. Well, this man can't be from God because he's not keeping the Sabbath. And we're going to be looking at this. Let's look right here. This man is not from God because he's not keeping the Sabbath. But others are saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? So here is this dichotomy. The dichotomy is either our traditions about the Sabbath is wrong, and this guy is from God, or this guy's not from God, but he heals people. How does that work? So here's this dichotomy, and here's what it says. And there was division among them. No kidding. There was division among them because they weren't talking about the right things. They weren't seeing what was really going on in front of them. So they said to the blind man again, What do you say about him? So they couldn't decide what was going on, so they decided, well, let's defer to the blind man. What do you say about him? And what is his response? He's a prophet. Well, that just complicates things, right? It would have been nice if he just said, I don't know, just some dude. But he said he's a prophet. He's a prophet. And so that complicates things. So the Jews did not believe it of him. No kidding. That the man had been blind and he had received his sight until they called the parents. So bring in the parents, right? What do you say he is? He's a prophet? Well, no, that can't be right. This isn't working. It doesn't fit in our parameters of what's going on. So we need to call in the parents. Yes, that's right. Bring in the parents. Was he born blind? Is the question. Well, how do they respond? Yeah, right? They asked him, Is this your son who you say was born blind? Then how does he see? And his parents answered and said, We know that, one, this is our son. We identify this as our son. and that he was born blind. Those two things we will affirm, okay, which doesn't help their case at all. But how he sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself. Verse 22, very crucial. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. He's old enough, ask himself. Thank you very much, we're leaving. Okay, so that's the response that the parents gave. Now, it's obvious that the parents are not very well off because they're allowing their child to beg. Okay, it's obvious. They needed the connections with the synagogue in order to sustain themselves, all right? If you are cut off from the synagogue, trade, commerce, all those kind of things that you relied upon are done, okay? Your connections are done, all right? It's a costly thing for you to be cut off from the synagogue. And there are various levels of that. You could be cut off for a day, and there were levels of punishment. But what they were talking about is you were dead to them, is what they're talking about in this particular case. And so they did not get the answer they wanted. That happens, right? They didn't get the answer. They're getting truth. What are they getting? Truth, but it's not what they wanted. Not the truth they wanted. And so the second time they called the man, and he's like, oh great, this is going to be awesome. So a second time they called the man born blind, and they said to him, give glory to God, which being translated is, just admit that God did this, and this can all go away. Right? Give glory to God. God did this. However you want to say, we're giving you another chance to kind of really tell us what happened here. And he says, we know that this man was a sinner. So just so you know, we're prodding you in the right direction. This guy was not the guy, this is not the man that healed you, okay? So he then answered, whether he's a sinner, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, I now see. Truth. Oh, complicating things again, right? He keeps saying the truth. He keeps sticking with this. He's not changing the answer. So they said to him, what did he have you do? How did he open your eyes? Now at this point, the man who was born blind, which we don't even know his name, we'll just keep calling him that, he's saying, he's getting a little bit testy at this. He's like, you're asking me again, okay? And so he says, verse 27, he answered them, I told you already, and you do not listen. They have a knack for that. Jesus has been saying the same thing. You're not listening, right? Why do you want to hear it again? You do not want to become his disciples too, do you? Ooh. Uh-oh. He's kind of poking there, isn't he? He knew exactly what he was doing. And they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. Right? Jesus had an answer to this earlier. If you were Moses' disciples or Abraham's descendants, Abraham was glad to see me in my day. But you are not. You are sons of the devil, is what he says on another case in response to this when they tried to do this with Jesus. And he says, we know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he is from. Look over in John chapter 8, verse 14. Did you know that they've already talked about this before? John chapter 8, verse 14, Jesus answered and said to them, even if I testify about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I came from and where I'm going, but you do not know where I came from or where I'm going. You judge according to the flesh. I am not judging anyone, but even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for I am not alone in it, but I and the Father who sent me. And so they've already had this discussion with Jesus, okay? And they do know where he's from. They just don't want to admit it because that's truth. And truth is messing up with their preconceived ideas of what really should be happening right now. And that gets in the way, right? Those pesky ideas about what really should be happening and then truth. It's getting in the way sometimes. It's going to be annoying. In this situation, the Pharisees had their ideas about what was really need to be happening. And so the man answered and said to them, well, here is an amazing thing. Well, here's a fine how do you do, I think is how you translate that in the Southern talk, right? Well, here is an amazing thing, and I almost see him putting his hands on his hips, because at this point he doesn't care, it sounds like. That you do not know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes. What is he talking about? Who can do these kind of things? God can. Nobody else has been able to do that. God can. And so this should be like an obvious neon sign, Eat at Joe's, pointing at this guy's from God, right? Do you remember those signs? Anybody? Okay. Neon signs, you guys know what those are? Big flashy ones? Okay. So this should be obvious. Obvious, right? I think you guys say obvi. Obvious. You shorten things a little bit. A little bit. Okay. Anyway, trying out words here, lingo. So it should be obvious. And he says, he is from, and yet he opened his eyes. Verse 31, we know that God does not hear sinners. We know that. We know that, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears him. Circle that. We're going to come back to that in a second. He hears him. Since the beginning of time, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Supreme truth, right? This guy's breaking it down for him. This guy's breaking it down. And they answer him, you are born entirely in sin, and you're teaching us? Go away from here. So if you don't like the message, what do? Discredit the messenger, right? We hear about that all the time, especially this time of year. So anyway, if you don't like the messenger, discredit the messenger. You were born in sin, which we go back to Ezekiel 20 or Ezekiel 18, right? You were born in sin, and you're teaching us, so they put him out. And that's how many? Okay, so they put him out. Go away from us. He's cast out from the synagogue, which sounds like he's kind of better off, right? Those guys are kind of mean. So they're not hearing, they're not seeing what's right in front of them, and they don't understand what's going on. And so, enter Jesus. Tie in verse 31. He hears him. Verse 35, Jesus heard. At least in the New American Standard. Jesus heard that they had put him out, and finding him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Jesus heard. Jesus could have been doing a lot of things, right? I healed him already. He's better off. I got other things to move on to. I have a full agenda, okay? But Jesus heard, and finding him, he goes back to the man. So chapter 9 is bookended here with experience with Jesus and truth. Testing of his faith. He stands tooth and nail against the righteous elite of the day. And then God comes back to him. Jesus heard, so here he goes back to his sheep. And he answered and said, who is he? Lord, that I may believe in him. All right, he's never seen him. He's not seen Jesus. All right, and apparently Jesus is sort of kind of blends in, because there's several times where they've tried to trap Jesus and like stone him, and he kind of just whoop, leaves. We don't know exactly what happens. Star Trek teleported, don't know. But he just kind of leaves. And, even they had to identify him in the end when they tried to arrest him. So, who is he that I may, what does he say? Who is he? I don't even know who he is. And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and he is the one who was talking. You've seen him and heard him. Love John and the way he writes. He is talking about knowing Jesus. John always writes about this tangible person that existed, that was with God and was with us. And in 1 John chapter 1, we've seen him eat, and we've touched him, and we've been around him in this tangible Jesus, but we've experienced him. We know him. We've seen him and we've heard him. And that's the message that John gives to the Grecians, people that are receiving this gospel. He was a person. He existed. He was God that walked among man, and he cared about people. He was not like your petty gods that could care less about you. Roman mythology, anybody? Greek mythology? Did they care really about people? Not so much. But Jesus heard people. Jesus heard. And he cared. And then he begins to teach again. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. So the first time he gets to see Jesus, he worships Jesus, which I pray will be the first time I get to see Jesus. I'll be worshiping with you. And Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, so that those who do not see might see, and that those who see may become blind. The Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, hey, what about us? We are not blind too, are we? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin, but since you say we see, your sin remains. If you want to mark out there, we don't have time. Mark 2, 16 and 17. Matthew 15, 14. We're going to end, look at Malachi 4. The issue is not with their eyes. The issue is not with their ears. The issue is with what, ladies and gentlemen? Their heart. Look at Malachi chapter 4. Verse 5 and 6. But I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children, the hearts of the children to their fathers, so that I will not come and smite the land with a curse. Jesus came to restore the hearts of people to God. Luke chapter 1 verse 17 specifically mentions this in relationship to Christ. This is the one who was restoring the hearts to God. If you want to, I don't have it on here, but so he's restoring this relationship with them so that they would not have this problem. It wasn't that they couldn't see, it's that their hearts were not in the right place. So takeaway for tonight, everybody else is blind. If your eyes have been opened and you understand about your relationship with Jesus, it doesn't matter what anybody else says, because why? They're blind. They do not know. 2 Corinthians 4:4. People will believe what they want to despite evidence. We know that. You know that. You've experienced it. Here's Jesus, the Son of God. If he couldn't do it, there's just people who are not going to listen, right? Not going to listen. Read chapter 10. Jesus hears his sheep. He went back and found this sheep. Do you think he was struggling? Do you think his life was turned upside down? He was kicked out. He was already marginalized, but he still got to kind of hang on. But now he's done. What is he going to do? Jesus heard. Do not trust in your own righteousness. Do not trust in your own righteousness. And beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Do not make traditions, the things that are tradition, more important than the Word of God. And that's what they did. And we see that epidemic and how that affects their hearts. And make sure we don't affect our hearts as well. That is all the time we have. Questions, comments? Thank you. All right. Shout outs. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.